You've heard of warrior kings. You've heard of conquerors, generals, and emperors. But what if I told you one of the greatest military leaders of ancient China wasn't a man at all but a princess? And here's the forbidden secret. She didn't just fight in her father's rebellion. She commanded her own army. Tens of thousands of men followed her into battle, swearing loyalty to a woman whose name the empire tried to bury. Her name was Princess Pingyang, daughter of Li Yuan, the man who would become the founding emperor of the Tang Dynasty. When her family was hunted by the ruling Sui, Pingyang did the unthinkable. While other royals fled or cowered, she raised a rebel force in secret, feeding peasants, bribing soldiers, rallying deserters, until her army of the lady became the most feared and respected unit in China. And here's the part they don't want you to know. When she died young, at just 23, the emperor himself declared that her funeral should be honored with full military rites, drums and banners blazing, because without her, the Tang Dynasty might never have been born. The story begins in chaos. The Sui Dynasty, once mighty, was crumbling under the weight of corruption, endless wars, and crushing taxes. Across China, peasants starved, rebellions erupted like brushfire, and whispers spread that the mandate of heaven, the divine blessing of rule, had abandoned the Sui. Into this storm was born Princess Pingyang, daughter of Li Yuan, a noble of the north who served the Sui court even as he dreamed of something greater. Pingyang grew up in a world gilded with silk and shadowed with fear. As a young woman, she learned calligraphy, poetry, and the rituals expected of a noble daughter. But she also listened to the anger of peasants outside the palace gates, listened to the murmurs of soldiers weary of pointless wars, listened to her father's sharp words about an emperor who had lost his way. These were lessons no tutor could teach. They carved steel into her spirit long before she ever touched a blade. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 617, Li Yuan rose in rebellion against the Sui, calling his banners in Taiyuan. He sent his sons to rally troops, prepared to gamble everything on the dream of empire. But Pingyang, just 23 years old, was left behind, her fate seemingly insignificant compared to the clash of armies. Her husband, Chai Shao, marched to join Li Yuan's forces. And Pingyang, she was alone in the capital region, deep in enemy territory. This is where most princesses would vanish from the chronicles. They would be captured, executed, or hidden away. But not. Instead of running, she made a choice that still shocks historians today. She would fight. But how could a princess fight in a world where women were forbidden to command armies? She did it the way only she could, by turning compassion into strategy, survival into rebellion. Pingyang began quietly, giving away her wealth, opening her estates to feed peasants who were starving under Sui taxes. Bread became banners, gratitude became loyalty, and slowly word spread. There was a princess who fed the hungry, who defied the corrupt, who dared to act when others cowered. Men began to gather around her. Farmers, deserters, bandits, former soldiers found their way to Pingyang's side. She welcomed them not as tools, but as allies, weaving them into a force bound not by fear, but by hope. What began as a handful of followers swelled into thousands, and soon the countryside whispered of the army of the lady. Picture it, villages once silent, with despair now alive with the tramp of feet. Banners painted with simple symbols fluttering in the wind. A young woman in armor riding among them, her presence both regal and fierce. To the Sui, this was unthinkable. To the rebels, it was destiny. The army of the lady struck with precision. Pingyang did not waste lives in reckless charges. She targeted supply lines, seized food stores, liberated villages from corrupt governors. Each victory fed the hungry, won new recruits, and spread her legend further. Soldiers who once swore to the Sui now defected, bringing their weapons with them. Farmers who once cursed nobles now raised spears at her command. By the time she linked with her father's forces, Pingyang commanded more than 70,000 men an army, born not of conquest but of defiance, loyalty, and survival. And Li Yuan knew the truth. Without his daughter's army, his rebellion might have starved before it could march. Pingyang had not just supported the Tang Kashi, had ignited it. Yet the story is not only one of triumph. Every choice carried danger. The Sui considered her a traitor and would have executed her without hesitation. Her gender made her a scandal, an anomaly in a world that saw women as ornaments, not leaders. And even within her father's ranks, whispers must have flown, whispers that a woman's hand commanded more loyalty than some of his sons. But Pingyang silenced them the only way that mattered. With victory, her army fought side by side with Li Yuan's forces as they swept south toward the Sui capital. The banners of the army of the lady mingled with the Tang banners in a tide of rebellion that broke the Sui once and for all. When Li Yuan declared himself the first emperor of the Tang dynasty, it was not just his triumph, it was hers. And yet, history is cruel. Pingyang died not long after her father's victory, still only 23 years old. Some say it was illness, others whisper intrigue, but the truth remains unclear. What is clear is this: the dynasty she helped create could not deny her. Emperor Gaozu, named Li Yuan, took as Tang's first emperor, ordered that his daughter be buried with full military honors. Drums thundered, banners snapped. Soldiers marched in her funeral procession, not in shame but in pride. It was unprecedented. Never before had a woman in imperial China been honored as a general, as a commander, as one who bore not just beauty, but the weight of an army. And in that moment, Princess Pingyang's name was sealed forever in history, not as a forgotten daughter, but as a warrior, a leader, a rebel who became the beating heart of a dynasty. When Princess Pingyang first made the decision to rebel, it wasn't done with the clash of swords or the roar of trumpets. It began in whispers, in shadows, in acts that looked like kindness, but were, in truth, weapons sharper than steel. Because Pingyang understood something that most warlords never grasped. Armies aren't born from fear, they are born from hunger, from loyalty, from the desperate hope that someone, anyone, will fight for the people instead of against them. The world she lived in was suffocating under the Sui dynasty. Emperor Yang, indulgent and arrogant, had drained the empire with endless construction projects and disastrous wars. Canals and palaces rose in splendor, but the hands that built them were calloused and bleeding. The peasants driven to exhaustion, their fields left untended. Taxes climbed higher, food grew scarcer, and famine spread across the land like a plague. Soldiers deserted their posts, not because they were cowards, but because their families were starving. This was the world into which Pingyang stepped not as a helpless woman, but as a strategist. She opened the granaries of her estates and distributed food. She welcomed the ragged and the desperate. And in that single act she declared something revolutionary, that her cause was theirs. Imagine her standing in the courtyard of her manor, the torchlight flickering across her face as she ladled rice into the bowls of peasants who had been forgotten by their emperor. That moment was not charity, it was recruitment. It was revolution, and it worked. Word spread like wildfire. Families whispered to neighbors. Travelers carried tales to villages beyond. There was a princess who fed the hungry, who defied the emperor, who dared to act where men had failed. Men who had once cursed nobles now gathered at her gates. Farmers brought their scythes, deserters brought their swords, bandits brought their cunning, and Pingyang, unafraid, wove them together into something new. The army of the lady. It began small, a few dozen men, ragged but willing. But each raid they carried out, each corrupt governor they overthrew, added hundreds more. Soldiers abandoned the Sui banners to join hers, not only because she promised food, but because she gave them dignity. She spoke to them not as tools, but as comrades. And this, more than gold or grain, bound them to her. Of course, it was not without risk. Every act of rebellion painted a target on her back. The Sui would have executed her without hesitation if she were caught. She was not a nameless peasant who could disappear into the hills. She was the daughter of Li Yuan, a noble of rank, a princess whose rebellion was treason of the highest order. Her name alone made her a threat. She built networks of spies and informants. She held meetings in secret, in barns and caves, her words carrying the weight of destiny. She sent envoys to sympathetic generals, promising safe passage if they defected. She bribed guards to look the other way, and when bribery failed, she convinced them with her fire. She used every tool at her disposal: wealth, wit, and the undeniable magnetism of her conviction. One by one, villages fell under her banner. At first, they were liberated. Quietly corrupt officials sent fleeing, tax collectors driven off, stores of grain redistributed. But soon, as her army grew, her victories became impossible to ignore. Small garrisons collapsed before her, their soldiers defecting rather than dying for an emperor they no longer believed in. Within months, her force swelled to thousands, and here is the miracle. They followed her without hesitation, though she was a woman in a world that scorned female command. She did not fight with brute strength, but with intelligence, strategy, and compassion. She proved again and again that she could outthink her enemies. Each village she liberated became another fortress in her chain, each ally another stone in the foundation of her rebellion. But there was another layer to her power, one that terrified the Sui. She was not only Li Yuan's daughter, she was a woman who inspired love. To the peasants, she was not a distant noble. She was their champion, one who had walked among them, listened to their hunger, and given them hope. That made her more dangerous than any general. By the time her husband, Chai Shao, rejoined her after rallying with her father's forces, he found something astonishing. Pingyang did not need protection. She had built an army of her own, disciplined, loyal, and fierce. Together, they began coordinating strikes that weakened the Sui even further. But make no mistake, the army of the lady was hers, not his. It was her name that echoed in the countryside, her face that appeared in the dreams of peasants, desperate for salvation. Imagine the sight of her army on the march. 10,000 men at first, then 20, then 70,000, banners rising like waves on the horizon. Farmers with spears marched beside deserters in rusted armor. Bandits carried bows, alongside monks wielding staffs. And at the heart of it all, Pingyang rode in armor, her gaze steady, her presence radiating authority. To see her was to believe she carried the mandate of heaven itself. Garrisons were sent to crush her, to erase the embarrassment of a princess commanding an army. But time after time they failed. Pingyang outmaneuvered them, striking where they were weakest, retreating when necessary, never wasting lives needlessly. Each failed attempt to defeat her only added to her legend. Soldiers muttered in fear. How could they defeat a woman who fought with heaven's blessing? But even as her victories mounted, danger stalked her. Betrayal was everywhere. Rival warlords who feared her power, spies who sought to uncover her plans, jealous generals who could not stomach the thought of a woman overshadowing them. Pingyang's path was lined with daggers, both visible and hidden, and still she pressed forward. By the time her father, Li Yuan, marched south in full rebellion, Pingyang's army was not merely an auxiliary force. It was the backbone of his campaign. Without her, his rebellion might have withered. With her, it thrived. She had turned famine into loyalty, despair into defiance, and in doing so, she had reshaped the fate of China. But her journey was far from over. Ahead lay not only victory, but tragedy. For though Pingyang's name blazed brighter than the banners of the Sui, her story would end far too soon. The dynasty she helped build would honor her in a way no woman had ever been honored before, but the cost was her life. By the time the army of the lady swelled to tens of thousands, whispers about Princess Pingyang had spread far beyond the villages she liberated. Across China, peasants and soldiers spoke her name with awe. In taverns, men leaned close and said, "There is a princess who feeds her people, who fights not for her own glory, but for all of us." Even generals of the collapsing Sui dynasty, hardened by years of war, admitted quietly to one another, Pingyang was no ordinary rebel. She was a force they could not control. Meanwhile, her father Li Yuan, rallying his banners in Taiyun, had begun his march. His rebellion was bold, but without food and manpower, it was a gamble teetering on disaster. What he did not yet fully realize was that the fate of his cause already rested in his daughter's hands. While he marched with soldiers trained in battle, Pingyang's army grew daily in numbers and morale. Her soldiers were not only fighters, they were believers. They fought not out of fear of punishment, but because they trusted their lady. When word reached Li Yuan that his daughter commanded an army of tens of thousands, his shock must have been mingled with pride and unease. For in the strict hierarchies of their world, where men wielded power and women were expected to remain in shadow, Pingyang's accomplishment was something both miraculous and unsettling. Yet Li Yuan was no fool. He knew that dismissing her would be suicide. Instead, he embraced her rebellion, folding her force into the Tang cause. From that moment on, Pingyang's army of the lady was no longer a sideshow, it was a pillar of the rising dynasty. The unification of their armies was a sight to behold. Imagine the banners of Li Yuan's seasoned soldiers, sorterly, disciplined, bearing the marks of nobility, joining with the rough but resolute banners of Pingyang's rebels. Farmers marched beside armored knights, monks beside deserters. It was as though all the broken pieces of the empire, all the fragments abandoned by the Sui, had gathered under one family's name. And at the center of this astonishing sight stood a princess in armor, riding beside her father and brothers as an equal. It wasn't just spectacle, it was strategy. The army of the lady had liberated crucial strongholds and supply routes, ensuring that Li Yuan's march did not starve along the way. Towns that might have resisted him, instead, when Li Yuan advanced on Chang'an, the Sui capital, it was not only with swords, but with the momentum of hearts already won by his daughters. Rebellion. The battles that followed were brutal. The Sui, though weakened, did not collapse without blood. Garrison after garrison resisted. Walls were stormed. Arrows darkened the sky. Through it all, Pingyang's army fought with a ferocity born of loyalty. Witnesses spoke of her presence on the battlefield, how soldiers surged forward at the sight of her banner, how even in the chaos of combat, her calm command held the line. Though she did not wield a sword herself, at least, the chronicles say little of her fighting. Her authority was ironclad. She commanded through brilliance, not brawn, through the unwavering trust of those who followed her, and slowly, inexorably, the tide turned. The Sui dynasty cracked, its soldiers defecting in droves, its people no longer willing to bleed for an emperor who had starved them. Every victory by Pingyang's forces was another nail in the coffin of a dying regime. And as Li Yuan finally seized Chang'an and declared himself Emperor Gaozu of Thames, one truth became undeniable. He might have raised the banner, but his daughter had built the foundation. But with victory came danger of another kind. Power attracts envy, and Pingyang's rise unsettled many. In the Tang court, some officials muttered that it was unseemly for a woman to command so great an army, that her fame rivaled even that of her brothers. Whispered accusations grew that she had overstepped her role, that she had courted scandal, that the army of the lady had been too independent. For men who had built their lives on control, the idea that a princess had outshone them was intolerable. Yet Emperor Gaozu silenced them, at least for the moment. He knew the truth. Without his daughter, the Tang might never have been born. Her army had not merely supported his cause, it had saved it. And so he honored her openly, calling her the cornerstone of his rebellion. He did what few fathers of emperors would ever dare. He acknowledged his daughter as a general, but still, the shadows of envy never faded. Pingyang was a woman ahead of her time, and such women are rarely allowed to thrive unchallenged. As the Tang dynasty settled into power, the army of the lady dispersed. Some soldiers returned to their farms, others joined the imperial ranks, their loyalty now sworn to the dynasty they had birthed. Pingyang, though stripped of her battlefield, carried the quiet pride of knowing she had done the impossible. She had turned compassion into strength, rebellion into dynasty, hunger into hope. Yet her triumph was fragile. Her health faltered, her body weary from the relentless strain of rebellion. At just 23 years old, her life began to fade. Perhaps it was illness, the toll of exhaustion and constant danger. Perhaps there were darker intrigues, jealous courtiers who whispered poison into her fate. The chronicles remain vague, their silence as heavy as their words. What is clear is that when Pingyang died, the loss was felt like thunder across the dynasty. For Emperor Gaozu, it was not only the death of a daughter, but the extinguishing of the light that had guided his rebellion. And in that grief, he made a choice as revolutionary as her life. He ordered that Pingyang be buried with full military honors. Soldiers marched in her funeral procession, their banners snapping in the wind, drums pounding like the heartbeat of the army she had once commanded. The people watched in awe, for never before had a woman in China been honored as a general, as one whose victories belonged to the realm, not merely her family. In that moment, Princess Pingyang transcended even the legend she had built. She became a symbol of the Thames itself, its salient, compassionate, unyielding. A woman who dared to lead when others fled. A princess who became a general. A daughter who forged a dynasty. Death came for Princess Pingyang far too soon. Barely 23 years old, with the Tang dynasty still fresh in its infancy, the woman who had fed peasants, rallied deserters, and commanded 70,000 men suddenly vanished from the world she had changed. The chronicles are quiet about the cause. Some say she fell ill after years of exhaustion, her body weakened by the ceaseless strain of rebellion. Others whisper of intrigue, of courtiers who envied her power and may have hastened her end. The truth lies hidden, as though history itself conspired to shroud the final days of a woman who had defied its expectations. But one thing could not be hidden: the grief that followed. Emperor Gaozu, the father she had served so loyally, was devastated. For all his power as the first Tang emperor, for all the cities and armies now under his command, he could not bring back the daughter who had helped build his throne. He could, however, do something unheard of, something that would immortalize her name forever. He decreed that Princess Pingyang be given a full military funeral. This was not merely a ceremony. It was a statement, a defiance of centuries of tradition that had relegated women to the margins of power. Never before had a woman in imperial China been buried as a general, with drums pounding, banners flying, and soldiers marching in solemn tribute. Picture the scene. The streets of Chang'an, still scarred from war, filled with the thunder of drums. Rows upon rows of armored soldiers carried spears and standards, their banners embroidered with the emblems of Thames at their center. Borne on a grand carriage lay the coffin of a princess, not cloaked in silks and flowers, but draped in the symbols of battle. Her funeral procession was not a whisper of courtly mourning. It was a roar, a declaration that her life had been as vital to the Thames as any campaign or treaty. The people watched in awe. Some wept openly, not only for her death, but for what she had represented. To peasants, she had been their savior, the noble who gave them food when emperors demanded their blood. To soldiers, she had been their commander, the woman whose banner they had followed into liberation. To her family, she had been a daughter and a sister, but now she was also a legend, and legends spread quickly. Songs rose in her honor, verses telling of the princess who fed the hungry and led the oppressed. Bards and chroniclers began to weave her into the myth of Tang's founding, placing her alongside her father and brothers as one of the architects of the dynasty. Her story, so extraordinary, seemed almost impossible, and in that impossibility it became divine. Yet her death also cast a shadow. For some, it was a reminder of how fragile victory could be, how even the strongest flame could burn out too soon. For others, it was an opportunity. With Pingyang gone, her brothers and rivals no longer had to compete with the brilliance of a sister whose reputation might have outshone their own. The court whispered, plotted, and moved on, as courts always do. But the people did not forget. The army of the lady disbanded, its men absorbed into other forces, its banners stored away. But its memory lived on in the minds of those who had marched behind it. Veterans told their children and grandchildren, "I once served the Lady General. I once followed a princess into battle." And in those words, her army never truly died. For Emperor Gaozu, the funeral was more than mourning. It was a political act as well. By honoring Pingyang so openly, he strengthened the legitimacy of his dynasty. He reminded the world that the Thames had been born not from greed but from compassion, from the rebellion of a daughter who fed the starving and won loyalty, not with terror but with kindness. Pingyang became both symbol and shield, her memory protecting the dynasty even as her body returned to the earth. Still, it is hard not to wonder, what might she have accomplished had she lived longer? Would she have continued to command armies? Would she have shaped policy, guided her father, influenced her brothers? Might the Tang dynasty have been even stronger with her hand steadying its course? These questions haunt her story, lingering like ghosts in the spaces where history falls silent. But perhaps that silence is part of her power. By dying young, Pingyang became immortal. She was preserved in memory as forever young, forever bold, forever the rebel princess who defied an empire. She never had time to be diminished, never had time to fade into the background of a court that might have sought to erase her. Instead, she remained sharp, brilliant, unforgettable. Her funeral set a precedent, though one rarely followed. Few women after her would receive such honors, and fewer still would lead armies on the scale she had. Yet, her story lingered in the chronicles, an echo that future generations of women could look to. Proof that even in the rigid structures of imperial China, there had been one who broke the mold, who proved that courage and strategy were not confined to men. And so, when we think of the Tang dynasty's golden age, its poets, its emperors, its conquest, we must also think of Pingyang. Without her, perhaps there would have been no Tang dynasty at all. Without her, the rebellion might have starved, the people might have turned away, the mandate of heaven might never have shifted. She was not only a princess, she was the pulse of the revolution. Her story ends with drums and banners, but it does not end in silence. For history remembers her not just as a daughter or a consort, but as a general, and that, more than anything, is the triumph she left behind. Legends do not end with death. If anything, they grow larger in its shadow, swelling until they outstrip the life that birthed them. And so it was with Princess Pingyang, the rebel general who lived only 23 years, yet etched her name into the stone of history. Her funeral had been thunderous, a roar of drums and banners that shook Chang'an. But the echoes did not fade when the soldiers laid down their arms. Those echoes rolled across centuries, reshaping how the Tang dynasty told its own birth and how later generations remembered the impossible story of a woman who led an army that, after Pingyang's death, Emperor Gaozu leaned heavily on the symbol she had become. In proclamations and chronicles, he allowed her deeds to shine as proof that the Tang had risen not merely through ambition, but through virtue. Pingyang's compassion, her distribution of food, her ability to win the hearts of peasants and deserters alike, all These were presented as evidence that heaven itself had favored the Thames by holding up his daughter as an exemplar of loyalty and righteousness. Gaozu strengthened his dynasty's legitimacy, and yet, even in honor, there was erasure. The chronicles praised her, but often in ways that softened her sharpness, framing her rebellion as an extension of her father's will rather than her own. They emphasized her compassion but downplayed her cunning, her brilliance as a strategist. They called her dutiful rather than daring, filial rather than fierce. It was as though they could not quite allow a woman to exist in the full glory of what she had been. And so, like smoke caught in the wind, some of her truth dissipated into myth. But myths are powerful things. The army of the lady lived on in stories told by veterans to their grandchildren, tales whispered in villages she had liberated. To those people, Pingyang was no mere dutiful daughter. She was the lady general, the savior who gave them rice when emperors gave them chains. The princess who proved that nobility could mean service, not cruelty. Her siblings carried on the dynasty she had helped build. Her brothers, Li Yuan, above all, who would become the great emperor Taizong shaped the Tang into one of the most powerful empires in Chinese history. But even their victories were inseparable from the foundation she had laid. Without her army, without the momentum she created, their triumph might have been ashes. In this way, her hand still rested on the dynasty long after she was gone. As centuries passed, her story flickered in and out of prominence. Some historians praised her as a paragon of virtue, a rare example of feminine leadership. Others minimized her, casting her as a supporting figure in her father's rebellion rather than the commander of 70,000. In times when women were silenced, her name dimmed. In times when women were celebrated, her memory blazed anew. But though the chronicles wavered, her funeral remained undeniable. The image of thousands of soldiers marching in honor of a woman was so astonishing, so unique, that it could not be erased. It was proof carved into the page that Pingyang had been more than myth. She had been real, and her defiance had been recognized even by emperors. And what of her legacy beyond the Thames? In every dynasty that followed, whispers of her name inspired women who longed to break their confines. She became a symbol not only in China, but in the broader history of women in war. Like Joan of Arc, centuries later in France, Pingyang became an answer to the question, can a woman lead an army? The answer, written in banners and blood, was yes. Today, her story resurfaces as a beacon of empowerment. In classrooms, in books, in documentaries, Princess Pingyang stands as proof that even in the most rigid of times, courage can shatter barriers. She is remembered not only as the daughter of Li Yuan, but as a commander in her own right, the general whose compassion and strategy toppled a dynasty and birthed another. And yet, perhaps the most powerful part of her story is not its grandeur, but its intimacy. Imagine her again in those first days of rebellion, not yet a general, not yet a legend, but a young woman standing before a crowd of starving peasants. Imagine her pressing food into their hands, telling them they were not forgotten, promising that together they could resist. In that moment, history shifted, not because of armies or emperors, but because of a single act of defiance wrapped in compassion. Pingyang's legacy reminds us that history is not only written in palaces and battlefields, it is written in courtyards where food is shared, in whispers of rebellion, in choices made by those the world least expects. She was never meant to lead an army. She was never meant to be remembered. And yet she became both, as her story concludes. See her not only in the armor of legend, but in the quiet dignity of survival. See her as the princess who fed the hungry, the commander who inspired loyalty, the daughter who became the backbone of a dynasty. See her funeral, banners flying, soldiers weeping, an emperor grieving. See her name, still alive 1,000 years later, proof that no force, not envy, not silence, not time, can erase a woman who dares to lead. Princess Pingyang, daughter of Li Yuan, general of 70,000, the rebel who became the beating heart of temps.